Welcome to Beyond Better, a podcast that explores a simple but profound idea. We all deserve to live lives we love, and that includes our work lives too. I'm Stacy, Ennis, an author and longtime location-independent entrepreneur living in Portugal with my family of 4. Join me as I talk business, location independence, writing, travel, and so much more. All focused on building a life that is beyond better. Welcome. I am so excited about this week's topic. We're going to be talking about burnout. We're going to be talking about balance and talking with an expert on the matter, which will be really great. You'll walk away with some excellent tips to help you avoid burnout or deal with burnout if you're in it. But before we jump over to this week's guest, I want to read a recent podcast review. Your reviews help me reach more listeners. They are huge and so helpful. I really appreciate those of you who've taken the time to leave a review. This one comes from AL Leadership Coach. AL says, must listen for entrepreneurs. This is one of my go-to podcasts. It's the perfect blend of inspiration, engaging stories, and my favorite, actionable advice. Yes, love that. Great for anyone who wants to elevate their life and work, but especially helpful for me as an entrepreneur who's focused on growing my business and impact. So thank you, AL. And for those of you who are longtime listeners, leave a review. I might read it on an upcoming episode. So without further ado, I want to welcome this week's guest, Amy Mangueira. Amy is a 4-time entrepreneur, author, and motivational speaker on a mission to rid the world of burnout. She experienced a rock bottom moment after burning herself out at her previous email agency that left her with sudden hearing loss in her left ear. Amy's goal is education and coaching women to find balance in their careers and lives, putting themselves first. Her new book, The Path to Break Free from Burnout, provides an actionable plan to recharge and reclaim your life. Welcome, Amy. I'm so excited to speak with you today.
Thanks, Stacy, for having me. So excited to be here.
I would love to hear the story of losing your hearing loss. Maybe we could start there because, wow, I mean, you must have been in such a difficult position, and I imagine that was a catalyst for the work that you do today.
Yeah, I would say that if I think about the day that my hearing went, I, in hindsight, had probably 4 moments where my body screamed to stop. I think in hindsight, when I think back, I really believe that your body is whispering to you a lot. And oftentimes we're just in the hustle mode. And so we ignore the whispers, but it's always going to scream. And the body is so much smarter than I think we give it credit for. So I did have a few other moments, but it was actually July 11th. I was on a run like I always usually am, and I was listening to my headphones. It's funny because I don't even listen to my headphones loud, and I hardly wear headphones running, but I had them in. And I was just about a half mile from home and I heard a sudden pop in my left ear. It was absolutely the most excruciating sound after that pop. I was like in the middle of the sidewalk holding my head. And all I could think about was like, you've just got to get home. So I put the headphones in my pocket, got home. And I remember getting home and every little sound, like the crunching of paper and the sound of dishes, were like debilitating. So obviously I immediately went to the primary care doctor, like, what happened today? And they misdiagnosed me in that moment with a ruptured eardrum. And so they said, put an earplug in. It's probably gonna, work itself out. The saving grace for me that same week was I went back and got some blood work and found out that my white blood cell count was 4 times the amount. I had so much inflammation in my body that it was like my doctor was like not about to prescribe anything, but Amy, what have you been doing? Like, are you under stress? And then we made the correlation of the sudden hearing loss. I immediately was referred to a doctor who looked at, an ENT doctor who found out that I did have a complete nerve sever. My body attacked itself. And it was all correlated to the chronic stress that I had been under for years. This wasn't like a buildup of, a couple months worth of stress.
Wow. I think for anybody who's listening who hasn't experienced any kind of ear issue, I know it's probably hard to understand how debilitating that is. I went through about a 2 week period with really severe tinnitus. And I remember thinking, and doesn't even sound like it was nearly as bad as yours, but I remember thinking like, I'm gonna lose my mind. Like I cannot function like this. I can't even live in this world like this. It was so miserable. But you think about how you process the world through these little holes in your head, right? Like the whole world comes through your eyes and your ears and of course touch. How did you then from that point get to where you are today? Right? Because you had this like really terrible health experience that was not just your ears, it was a signal from your body that something had to shift. And then now today, you're writing about this and you're helping other women not go down that route or get out of that route. So talk me through that journey and what do you do today to support women who are in similar places?
Yeah, I think the hardest part about that question in looking back is that from the outside to everybody else, when you are a high performer and achiever and you're in the burnout syndrome internally, outside you still look like a hero and a superhero and this amazing successful person to everybody else. And so it provides sort of a really hard place to ask for help and say that you need help, and tell people that really what was going on inside me. I was absolutely depressed, super cynical. I did not feel well. I was extremely sick all the time. Like I felt terrible all the time. And so when my ear kind of gave out, and it was a big awakening for me to be like, Amy, you have to stop now. It was a really big period of time where I had to start to have like almost me leading an intervention with my family and letting them know, hey, this is what's been going on. This business is going to kill me probably if I don't make changes now. It took me really sitting in sort of a kind of like stopping it all. At the time, I had my email agency. I had like 24 clients and I had a few people that were helping me. It took reaching out to those folks and being like, can we distribute the work across for you guys? I'll still be here for support, but can you take the lead a little bit more? And it really had me sitting down and asking myself, like, who was I right now? Like, did I even really feel fulfillment in this role? Is this where I imagined myself moving over the course of my career? And the answer was no. The answer was no. Looking back and reflecting, I really hadn't been fulfilled and happy in this business. It wasn't the same fulfillment as I felt previously as an educator, or helping and serving others, right? And so there was a lot of introspective work that had to be done. And that led me to creating sort of this map that I call in my book the Your Future Self Roadmap. But it was sort of this 90-day plan that provided me a light at the end of the tunnel, that like I wasn't stuck here. And I slowly had to make 1% improvements daily to get to that goal. It looked like selling my agency. That was the first big step. It no longer served me, and frankly, like I didn't see a life where balance could be possible with that with that in my life. It just wasn't part of the job. It was also sitting down and like documenting this journey in a book. I think sometimes we write books because we are seeking help ourselves and we want to document what's working for other people. And that sort of is how this book came to life, is me trial and erroring, like, okay, I'm on this journey towards this brighter future. I've reconnected with my authentic self, and now I'm doing a couple of things here and there and prioritizing self-care and new balance oriented rest and recovery. This worked, this really didn't. Here's how I pivoted. And I think it was creating a framework. And so I realized through that process that, at my root, I am an educator and a coach. Like I feel fulfilled serving people. And so naturally, I feel like it came full circle to put me in a position now to be able to help people not reach that rock bottom. But the lingering effects of really reaching burnout, they're there to stay. This isn't something you recover from in a week or a month. It is now almost going on a year from when I lost my hearing, right? I'm just now restoring my white blood cell counts and my inflammation levels. It's taken dedication to diet and rest and good exercise. The hearing loss has literally been one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with because you experience life differently. And my hearing loss isn't like just putting in a hearing aid. I don't need to amplify sound. Ironically, my other good ear is trying to constantly bring more sound. So my voice sounds louder to me, everything sounds louder to me. So I have to wear this earplug in most of the day just to get by. And for everyone listening, I think what we don't realize is any sudden change like that causes major health anxiety. So I suffer from extreme health anxiety that I've had to seek therapy for. I can't tell you how many panic attacks I go into. Like, what if my other ear goes tomorrow? And I'm suddenly deaf. Nobody I know knows sign language. Nobody can speak to me. I mean, so it has been a lot. But because I have done the work with the book and because I'm coaching people, it's a reminder every day that this work is just continuous. And I have found harmonization in all of it.
Mm. I love that you worked on your book as you were going through the journey. So often I meet aspiring authors who tell me, oh, it's just not the right time. I feel like I need to do XYZ before I can write a book. And I'm often coming back to them and saying, like, listen, you don't have to write like the, anthology of life. You need to write a book for somebody who's a few steps behind you. And I can even, say, bringing to another example in my own business, I've been working with a coach she's about 2 years, 3 years maybe, kind of ahead of where I am. And her closeness to my situation has been a huge asset because she really understands the challenges I face. They're so fresh to her. She really gets it. Whereas in the past, when I've, worked with people who are much further along, it's like they can be very helpful, but there's a little bit of a disconnect. So I love that you use that experience and that the book was part of your journey. One thing I would love to talk about is your actual writing experience. I know before we hit record, we talked a little bit about the journey of writing and how it can be lonely and vulnerable and a little bit confusing. I've experienced all of that myself early on when I first started writing books. But I'm curious because you've described this as like a journey and part of your own growth and development. Can you walk me through what the process of writing your book was like and how you kind of grew through that?
Yeah. Well, it was first, I will say, a very, very vulnerable experience because like I mentioned before, to date, I had not really everyone thought I was like just this happy, successful woman. So it was like really unhashing a lot of the mental health struggles I was going through and the real states. It was facing a lot of emotions I had suppressed and a lot of denials I had suppressed. Plus, I also felt like revealing some of these things, I felt a little bit guilty. Like, for instance, there's a part in my book where I talk about how I was really resentful for my husband's schedule, how he always seemed to have balance and how I was constantly like burning the midnight oil and I didn't see another way. And so I felt a little bit guilty, as I was revealing these truths. Um, but I think the journey of writing the book, it was kind of like I had created this like 90-day roadmap. And that consisted of like really first, tapping into my authentic self. And then it also consisted of like understanding my stress triggers and really starting to master boundaries. And then I moved into self care pillars and I prioritized the ones that I was really struggling with and kind of worked my way backwards. And for me, it was like I wasn't eating well at all. I was missing meals in some cases. I needed to redefine my relationship with movement in exercise because I was using it literally to exhaust myself to sleep because my sleep was so impacted by burnout that I was having nightmares and insomnia. So I figured if I could run, and then have a crazy day ahead of me, I would be able to somehow process the stress through extreme exercise. So those were sort of the three self-care pillars that I went through. But as I went through this journey, I basically every day or week, I had sort of like the to-do list, the milestones on this roadmap, and I would take time twice a week to get into the Word document and go ahead and like document what I had found to work or any sort of anecdotes. I also was layering in a little bit of storytelling. I was sharing one story per week that I had been holding really tight to the vest. Um, and then I decided about 30 days in that I was like, there's got to be other people out there that feel this way. So I kind of just started to reach out through LinkedIn and said, hey, if anybody has a story about extreme stress or burnout that they'd like to share with me, connect with me on LinkedIn. And so people in droves were like, I'd like to tell you my story. So I was starting to like also get stories from other people that also made me feel a little bit more courageous to continue this process. And then, met up with an editor that I really trusted. It was a friend of my husband's. She started to take my manuscript then and like start to put it into a way where it was like cohesive. And she was taking my thoughts and my stories and just making them a little bit more adaptable for a reader to implement themselves. Then I made it my goal in September. I was going on a running retreat where I was pretty much unplugged. It was my first vacation ever in my life that I didn't have to work. Just want to pause there for a second. I had never been on vacation before where I did not have to work. So it was huge. It was the first time I'd ever been unplugged. But I figured I have so much time. I'm just going to go ahead and like power through the rest of it because I knew that if I had like uninterrupted time to just have that brain share and meditative like solitude, I could get through the rest of it. And so I got through the rest of my chapters there, but I saved the ending for right before I published because I really wanted folks to understand like who I had become in the process, like what the transformation looked like for me. And so at the time of publishing, I was probably about 160 days in, and I had a clear vision of where I was going. I was really doing well, like managing things, but was able to reflect like this is long-term work. And then my last part obviously was giving the acknowledgments or the dedication. And I decided to dedicate it to my future self because I do not ever want to be in this position again. And it just reminds me every time I feel like I might be going into old habits, I have that dedication page like sitting here and I read it I read it over and over again.
Mm. Yeah, I love what a journey you've been on and your willingness to share that. I'm sure that there are people listening or watching right now that are starting to recognize maybe some of the signs in their own life. You've mentioned a lot of physical symptoms. We've talked about, in your case, you had the hearing loss. You've talked about sleeplessness, anxiety. I think you mentioned depression earlier,
Yeah.
just kind of overwhelming kind of feelings internally. What are some other things that could be signs of either current burnout or impending burnout?
Well, this is my favorite question because I really like to talk about the actual stages just briefly. I think the most important one to pay attention to is what we call, like I like to call the honeymoon stage. And that's actually the stage when we're getting ready to start anything new in our life that we like jump into it so full force. We're oftentimes trying to prove our worth in this stage, but we're like thriving oftentimes in this moment on like being busy. It's like a badge of honor we wear, you know? And I like to always say, for instance, I had a coaching client the other day who just started a new job and she's so excited and that's great and I'm pumped for her. I sat down and asked her, what are 3 boundaries you can put in place right off the bat to protect yourself? Because we oftentimes are like, my calendar's wide open, my time is wide open, take all of my energy away. And so I think the honeymoon stage is really that first stage where if you notice that you are like 0 to 60, it's probably time to stop and ask yourself, like, what can I do right now to just protect the time and harmonize and balance out the other facets of the wheel of life that I have, right? I have so many other parts of my life, but burnout typically does stem in one area. And it generally is career, because that's where we tend to find, we think, fulfillment and success quicker. We can prove our worth there. So that's the honeymoon stage. That's like number one. So if you're anyone out there who's like bent, you're in this like mode of like, yeah, I'm gonna miss dinner because I have a meeting and I never have any white space on my calendar. Like, don't wear that as a badge of honor. Let's think about how we can protect yourself. I'd say though that as you sort of progress, we have the onset of stress. And so one thing that typically starts to happen there is like tension is the body crying for attention. So anytime you're starting to notice you've got tension in your shoulders, little weird cramps happening in your scapula, like you're starting to get headaches a little bit. And then I've even had clients say like, I don't feel like I can digest food, or I just feel really bloated lately. It's likely because of the stressful moments, or the fact that we're go, we're eating on the run, we're just a little bit more tense. And so pay really close attention to that. I would say too, as you progress into like chronic stress and burnout, isolation is a big one. So you start to become a little bit cynical and negative, but you also start to isolate. And where I was completely isolating, especially from my family. And that was a really big indicator that I knew something was wrong. But I think that's actually where my family maybe started to be like, are you okay? I remember in May and June last year, they asked me a lot, like, are you doing okay? Because I was like, I don't want to eat pizza on Friday anymore. It's something I've done for like 15 years every Friday. And I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. So you really have to look for like isolation. And I would say the other thing is that if you feel like you're coming home every single day, and when you're asked the question of like, how was work today? And you immediately just start spewing like frustration and stress. That is often an indicator that if you listen to those stress trends over time, you can likely find roots to the problems that you can solve. So I like to always make people aware of like, do you have increased complaining? Or are you starting to feel like you're a little bit more miserable or, agitated than you were before? It's like little things like that.
These are so specific and so helpful, Amy. Something that I jotted down while you were talking in the earlier stages, especially, but I think it's like this really dangerous aspect of those early stages is this glamorization of hustle. Like,
Yep.
and I have to say, as somebody who lives now, I've lived outside of the U.S. for gosh, a lot of my adult life. I've been in Europe now for almost 4 years. And then before that, we were in Asian countries and then Caribbean, right? So it's like all very, very different ways of kind of approaching work and life. One of the best things that I did for myself was removing myself from the US because the culture that I was in, as much as I love my people, I'm a naturally type A driven, like go, 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 go type of person. And for me, being out of that environment and being in an environment that's like, oh yeah, we close down for 2 months a year to spend time with family. like, and we have twice as many holidays here. Probably, I bet you would be about twice as many days off in Portugal as you do in the U.S. because it's an older country. They have more holidays. So my curiosity back to you is, a lot of listeners, readers, there are things in their life they probably have more control over than they realize. There are other things that they have to navigate, right? So what is your advice to somebody who's hearing that and going, I'm recognizing that I can definitely point to my work situation, for example, or the community that I'm surrounding myself in? How do you advise somebody who's beginning to build that awareness and then starts to feel like they don't have control? How do you help them start to see where they do have control and that they can start taking actual action to make things better?
Yeah, that's this is one of my favorite questions. I get it a lot. A lot of people always say, "Well, I'm miserable," or I really am stressed out, but I can't quit my job, right? It's not an option. But I think what I like to say is that you said it beautifully. The United States in particular has a hustle mentality. I mean, I think there was a recent Gallup survey that said 70% of Gen Z respondents have two full-time jobs right now. I mean, that's obviously a path to
That's
burnout.
wild.
But
That's wild.
yeah,
Yeah.
so we have a hustle culture. We also then marry that up with if we're a mom, a busy mom or a busy parent, we marry that up with then social media where we're constantly have this like always on comparison thing going on, thinking we're never doing enough. It's like a very overwhelming, distracting time to be alive. And frankly, in the world of evolution, we are ill evolved to be in this chronic stress all the time. Like we are not evolved to handle it. Our bodies aren't. And so it's really interesting because when I first sought out to coach in on this topic and I had done a ton of research, like even the book was being published and I was and then thicker research. And I really started to think to myself, I've worked with a couple companies now, and there is little room to sit down with a company and say, hey guys, how can I help you help your employees avoid burnout? They're just company cultures that are rooted in certain principles and philosophies that have been going on for hundreds of years. Some of them are in hundreds of years, some of these big labels. So what we have to remember is it does come down to the individual. It starts with every single individual. And how I always approach this is that it always starts with boundaries. You identify your stress triggers first. If you can get them all out on paper, sometimes it's taking a week. We sit down and we record everything that draws that fight or flight response. Where is the tension coming from? What is your boss doing that's driving you crazy? What sort of things in the organization are just not okay for you and they're causing you stress? We write those down. Then we prioritize them because, like you mentioned, it's very scary. We feel like we're out of control. Like, oh, I could never say no to my boss. When he throws a meeting on my calendar, I have to accept, or, I might get fired. What we start to do is we prioritize these potential boundaries in a way where we pick first the one that we feel really comfortable with. So maybe it's something simple like you just go in and block your calendar a couple days a week for you to take an hour to do heads down work, and your communication to anybody in the organization is that those are your productivity times and you do not move them no matter what. And you let that go for a couple weeks. That one action creates like what I like to call a resilience armor. It's like you're putting a shield, one piece of a shield onto your body every time you put a boundary in place. You're going to feel more confident. You then go from there and you start to say, okay, what's causing me the most stress right now? Maybe let me tackle that one. If we can do that little by little, little improvements over time, we are going to take back control. And frankly, my advice to people is that if you put a boundary in place where you're like, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to take calls after 5 because that's family time, and you're still working your 8-hour shift and your boss seems okay with it, but they're still completely violating your boundaries, it might be a time where you put that 90-day roadmap in place. And that might be where your core values and who you are don't align to this company. Maybe it's the job, you're just not feeling fulfilled. You've given it a go. And so it's time to career pivot. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it all starts with putting those boundaries in place little by little and building that resilience armor.
I like the way that you've described this and the active aspect of this. And it got me thinking about when I'm working with aspiring authors, the biggest challenge other than a skills gap that aspiring authors face is time. Like if I could have, they'll say, if I could have a dime for any time, every time somebody said, I don't have time to write my book, like I would be a bazillionaire.
I know.
And right. And what's funny is when I dig in with people and we actually look at their calendar and we explore whether like blocking time on the calendar is possible, it's like almost always like, oh no, I can't. That's not going to work. Have you had a conversation with somebody about this? Have you explored ways? No. So that's like we just decide things aren't going to work without actually like doing that testing or asking or, communication to build that space. So I love how you're thinking about those boundaries, but I think it's also in a respectful way. And the other piece of this that I really want to talk about that I think is a really important component, you mentioned you're still doing your 8 hours and, still performing in your role. I would then actually extend that to say that when you do honor that space, you actually perform better,
Yes.
right? Which is this
Yes.
other piece that like people might be listening thinking, but if I put these boundaries, like I'm so driven, how am I going to still be this like driven person? So maybe you can talk about that for a moment, and how does that actually amplify your ability to do the work and like show up the way you want to show up?
Uh, so this to me, this is resource allocation. I think again, going back to specifically the United States, we have an obsession over time management. So all you ever hear about
Yes.
is time management techniques and time management hacks. But for a person that is chasing busy or naturally like a type A, I want to check everything off this list, we enter a mode of constant efficiency. And it's like, how can I
Mm,
fill every white space of my calendar with something so I can be efficient and manage my time? But what we forget is the resource of energy. We're not all tasks are energy equal, right? We deplete more energy doing certain tasks. And so, for instance, when I would take 5 meetings back to back, while I thought that that was a really good use of time because I was getting to the bottom of all of these different problems on my to-do list, not only was I depleting my energy and never allowing myself to recharge the energy, but I also didn't allow myself really enough time to actually do the to-dos from that amount of meetings. So we're all in this world of time management, but we have to remember that there's energy management too. And so for us to think about an 8 hour day, we have to think about it in a balance of effectiveness versus efficiency. There are days where you need to have efficient days. These are the days, or this is the 4 hour slot to checking off all the boxes. I had 4 meetings yesterday. They come with these to dos. I need to protect this time to check these boxes. And that it's too much for the brain to jump into a meeting, jump back to a task list, into a meeting, jump out back to a task list. We're not multitaskers. Even though that world wants us to believe that multitasking is a thing, it is extremely energy draining for our bodies and it doesn't allow for energy restoration. And so, for us to think about how can I have a couple of those efficiency blocks in the week where I'm just going to crank out tasks, and how can I have effectiveness blocks in my week where I'm actually going to save this time for professional development, for growth, for taking a rest, for connecting with my colleagues, for enriching something that I want to improve the business. It's so funny. I always talk to leaders and they're always like, oh, I don't have time to work on the business. I don't have time for strategy work. I have to do all these things. You have to make time for it. So it's a balance of like your efficiency and your effectiveness tasks, and then how we can pepper in just moments for recharge. It makes us so much more productive because we have the energy to get it all done. One thing I'll say is that the burnout stats out there are wild as it relates to just being run down, brain fog. That's another really big trait. You get decision fatigue to the point where it's hard to make decisions and you're struggling to even like you're looking at an Excel spreadsheet, probably something you've done time and time again, but you for the life of you can't move forward on it cuz you have no energy.
mm,
So, just like you would treat your car, especially a premium car, you would always put premium gas in your premium car. We rarely let our cars even go to the point where the light comes on. You have to recharge. your body. You have to put gas in, you have to stay energized. And so I hope that answered your question. I just think people need to remember that we're not always at we're not always on some sort of a mission to check boxes all the time and fill every ounce of white space on our calendar.
Yes. Oh, amen. Amen. It's so important. And I love how you're thinking about that efficiency and effectiveness as being like broken up separately.
Yeah.
In my own calendar, it's been really important to me that I don't schedule any meetings before lunch. So I have my whole
Love that.
morning that's really focused and spacious, and that I have minimum of one day of no meetings a week. And you brought up meetings earlier. I think it's finding that balance too. For me, I have like Tuesday through Thursday are my heavier meeting days,
Mhm.
but Monday is just the team and then Friday is nothing. So I have this kind of like ease in and then some intensity, and then I have this like data process and work on the business. So I love the way that you've laid this out. I'm sure there's even more detail in your book, The Path to Break Free from Burnout. Amy, this was such a great conversation. I feel like we could continue for another, hour, but I'd love for you to share with our viewers and listeners where they can learn more about you. And I'd love to hear what you're most excited about in your life and or your business right now.
I would say what I'm most excited about is actually slowing down. I always reference it as a car. Like I've always been in the fast lane, driving like 60 miles an hour, and I'm actually in the right-hand lane right now. It has been so liberating to be so much more intentional about each and every one of my days. And I am just so excited that this can be the way that I live and feel fulfilled. And so, as a recovering chaser of busy, I am feeling so excited that it is possible to live and be, successful with all the metrics that I have and the goals, but also be a little bit slower and more intentional about how I spend my time. So I am most excited about that. The best place for folks to get a hold of me is I'm pretty active on Instagram at Project Amy. I say Project Amy because I am a work in progress all the time. And so my whole life is just learning as many things as possible. And you can visit my website, amymangueira.com. I do have group burnout coaching if you're really struggling through burnout, as well as corporate workshops to help bigger groups of employees.
Well, thank you, Amy. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Stacy.
And thanks so much for all of you for joining us as well. I hope you got so much value out of this conversation. I want to say thank you, as always, to my team, to Rita Dominguez, to Catherine Fishman, and to Kim Foster. I appreciate all of you amazing women so much for making this podcast possible. And I will look forward to being back with you next week.